Hi, this is Stuart Leasor from Chiselbury. Today I'm talking to one of our authors, Hank Williams, about his new novel, What Fools We Have Been. It's a novel about family, memory, and inheritance, but also about the stories families tell themselves, the things they leave unsaid, and the damage that can pass from one generation to another. At the center of the book is a family stretching across several generations, and a 14-year-old girl, Jess, who decides she wants to understand not simply who her relatives were, but what they were like. And as she puts it, she wants traits, not dates. So, Hank, welcome to Chiselbury Conversations.
Hi, thank you, Stuart. Nice to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. So we'll kick straight off. Where did What Fools You Have Been begin for you? Was there a particular character, image, or idea that started the whole thing?
It was I had an idea for a short story about 15 years ago, actually, and it was about a son inviting his dead mother, the memory of his dead mother, to visit him. And I never wrote it, but I was doing some other writing about mothers and daughters, and the idea came back to me. So I started writing it, and people were very encouraging. Everybody said, "Oh, you should really focus on that. That's a really interesting idea." So it started with that, and it was going to be a short story. And I finished it, and people said, "You've got to develop this. It's lovely." So I developed it into a slightly bigger, sort of extended story, and then kept writing. So I ended up with a load of material, and was left with, how do I put this together? How do I edit it like a film? How do I edit it together and assemble it? And the idea came very late, how I could structure the thing. But it started with that idea, because my mother died when I was 23. And I think at the time, when I had the idea originally, I think I must have been thinking it would be lovely to talk to her again and to have the conversation as an adult that I've never been able to have. And it's funny, because people who've read the book, a lot of people have had mothers particularly who died young, and so the book has really resonated for people just around that very simple idea of reconnecting with the past through the medium of memory and imagination.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, and early in the book, Jess starts constructing a family tree, but says she doesn't really want dates, but she wants traits. That seems almost like a statement of what the whole novel is trying to do. Was that deliberate?
Yeah, it was. I mean, Jess as a character appeared at the end of the process of writing the book. She was like the last piece of it, really. And so that very beginning chapter and the last chapter where she features were the last two chapters that I wrote. So I can't say it was the driving ambition around the book. But when I wrote it, and I don't know where it came from, it just popped into my head. And I was in Jess, I think, as I wrote it. She's worried about what her inheritance is. She's interested in who she is. She's 14, 15 years old. She's very, self-interested in that sense. And she's uncovering this family which has clearly been dysfunctional, where there's clearly been a lot of disconnection. And so what she wants to know is, what are the genes that are being passed down to me, and how are they going to shape my character?
Yeah, I mean, is it almost our temperament and behaviour more important in the book than blood, or?
Sorry, say that again. I couldn't hear the beginning.
Are temperament and behaviour more important in the book than blood?
That's a really good question. I think the book is about the tension between the two, and the extent to which you can resist the blood inheritance and shape your behaviour in spite of it, and shape your personality in spite of it. And it's a conflict within the book. And I think what Jess is trying to do is really spring herself from the trap of inheritance, I think.
Fascinating. I mean, because one of the other things that's interesting about the structure, and I think unlike most books that begin at the beginning and move forward, the novel gradually moves backwards through the generations and then comes forward again. How difficult was that structure to devise? I mean, where did it come from?
Well, I'll tell you exactly where it came from. I was talking to my editor, Laura, who you know, and I just kept sending her additional material. I was asking her to read bits, and before she'd got to read the bit I'd sent her, I would send her another bit. And I was having this conversation with her about should I integrate all these? Does it? And she said, "Oh, you must integrate them." And the minute she said that, I saw the structure in my mind. I could exactly see. I think I just sent her the Jess chapters, which were the last two, and I suddenly thought, yes, I can work backwards. I can use the Morecambe Bay chapters and group them together, because those first four chapters, Morecambe Bay and the view and the sea and the sand, are a huge factor in how everybody shifts and changes, actually. And I thought, well, that would work. And to go backwards just seemed very interesting to me as a way to do it. And then in the next section, you move forward. So there's this sense of the tide going out, tide coming in through the structure as well as through the writing, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And when you read it, it certainly does. And did you have a detailed family chronology beside you at the start, or it seems as though you picked up bits as you went along?
I did, and you'll remember, I got Jess to write a family tree for her own benefit, and I didn't think much of it at the time, but almost everybody I've spoken to who's read the book has thanked me for the fact that there's a family tree that they can refer to. Because although for me the characters are very vivid, clearly in a short book there's a lot of people and the relationships between them. You have to kind of hold on to them. So I was very clear, although there were times when I did have to write it down for myself. I have to admit, there were times when I was thinking, hold on a minute, who's whom to who at this point.
Yeah, but I think some authors have almost a great sort of chart, literally like a sort of Excel spreadsheet, and think, they've got to move to serial 57 now, and others, it's as it comes out the pot,
Yeah, I'm very much with this book, particularly as it came out of the pot. It kept coming out of me, this book. It wasn't, and I tell you how. I mean, I would typically wake up at 3 a.m. And I would grab my phone and start writing in the notes, almost verbatim what appeared in the book. So it was coming out of my subconscious in a particular way. And I was allowing it to do that. I mean, I was very interested in the process and willing. I didn't try and over control the process or the material until I had to start editing it together and sending it. So yes, I was very unstructured in the way that I wrote this, and I certainly didn't have a spreadsheet.
One of the most interesting devices as well is that there is David discovering how little he really knows about his mother, Ruth, and decided to write her story himself, an imagined life. Why did you want a piece of imagined fiction sitting inside fiction? It's a sort of Matryoshka doll.
It is. It's a book within a book. And it was after I wrote the first chapter, the short story that I told you about. That's what came out of it. I ended up writing those 4 chapters, which are the imagined life. And then I wrote a chapter in which David's mother, Ruth, who's this memory, has in effect read that book somehow. He imagines that she's read what he's written about her, and she comes back to visit him. And that initially was the book. And then, as I say, it kept expanding, and I brought more generations in. So that story was originally quite central to the dynamic between the mother and the son, between David and Ruth. And it was a contested area, but it was very much about memory and imagination, and how David is. So the Ruth in the story is different from the Ruth that visits. Right. And this, I've only just become really clear about that myself. I was going on a walk the other day, and I thought, that's what it is. The Ruth that comes to visit him, the memory of his mother, is a different person, because it's who he wants her to be, than the Ruth that's in the 4 chapters of the story he writes about her, which is a far more accurate description, probably, of who his mother is. Okay.
But do you think, how much do you think that any family history depends on imagination? Because, when we're growing up, we imagine our parents are great champions of everything. And then one realizes that perhaps they're not. And one sees the same with one's own children. But how much is actually imagination, do you think? And I think that's where you've got this really fascinating thing, which you've picked up in this book, is actually to encapsulate that sort of
Yeah,
dichotomy.
I think a huge amount of it is. It depends how open the family is. David's family, as you said earlier, they don't talk. And so I think if it's a secretive family, or a family that isn't open about its past or open about its present particularly, then I think the child imagines a lot. I think they do anyway. But I think the more space there is for them to have to imagine, the more they imagine. And David, it was a dysfunctional family, and he didn't understand. As a child, it was impossible for him to understand it, I think. And it's only later, when he reflects on it and remembers, that his imagination comes into play, because there's so many gaps. And that's why it's a sort of a book about memory and imagination. It's, some things he can remember. Most of it he has to make up.
But do you think there is such a thing as an objective family history in this novel?
Well, I think I've got a number of friends who are doing, putting together their family. It's a thing these days, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've done a bit myself too, and you discover, even maybe you don't discover, that you had a Mexican archbishop as a thing, but you do discover some things you didn't know about,
Yeah, I think so. And people seem very interested in trying to concretize it. I think I'm not particularly, in terms of my family. I don't have any. I would never do that, and so I think I'm much more willing to use my imagination to try and interpret the fragments that I have about my own family. And I think that's true of David, in that I think he would like to know more. And he brings his mother back because he wants to ask her, and she can't answer him, because actually she's only his memory. And that's part of the limitation that he finds, which is why he writes The Imagined Life, because he realizes that even though he's invited his mother back and they have this conversation as they walk and look over Morecambe Bay, he can't get more concrete information from her, because all she can give him is what he already knows, because she's his memory.
Yeah, it's a sort of computer. What's actually in the computer, you might reinterpret it, but you can't add something new, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think what he comes to is he comes to it with new feeling and new emotion, but he doesn't come out of it with any greater understanding or knowledge.
Again and again in the novel, parents and children love one another, but they fail to communicate that love.
Yeah.
Is that one of the central tragedies of the book, and maybe of life itself?
Oh, Stuart, wow, good question. I think it is. I think there's a real struggle in the book, and I think parenting is just very difficult, and I think it is hard for parents. I mean, I look back. I mean, I've got stepsons. I look back at, and I try to be very open and communicative. But openness is a strange commodity, it seems to me. And what the openness that children need isn't always the openness that the parent can give, for whatever reason. They're not willing to, or they're not able to. So I think there is almost built into the parent-child relationship a level of miscommunication or under-communication. I think that
perhaps it's designed to stimulate the child, just in genetically, to sort of try harder or whatever. But as you said, it's, and I think silence sometimes does as much damage in the book, as anger,
Yes, I think that's true.
Are there moments, do you think, where one conversation could have changed everything? Do you certainly think this was a sort of sliding doors moment when you were writing the book? You could have gone in a different direction.
I think there were, yes, I think there are several, probably, but I think there's a central event between David and his father that could have gone differently. Should have gone differently, probably. And it would have been, but actually, if it had, I don't think the book would have happened. It's so integral to the book. But it's certainly a conversation as I wrote it and as I thought about it, because it was disastrous. But it was so avoidable. It's so avoidable. But the fact is, there was so much stacked emotion being crystallized in that moment of communication. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah,
so much history coming to play, particularly for the older person, the father, that the avoidable becomes inevitable, and it becomes unavoidable. And I don't think it could have played out any other way. I just think the forces that shaped it were too great, and I think the book's about that to some degree. That the forces, this book, it sort of springs out of the experiences people had in the Second World War and the Holocaust, and some of the shaping power of those experiences. I think this is what the book's saying. They're almost impossible to contest in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only as the generations work through, and you get to Jess, who's the fifth generation, with her determination to challenge the script and the narrative, this dominant narrative, that you get a glimmer that there is a possibility of escape. But only then, really, does that possibility of escape emerge.
Mm-hmm. Charlie is perhaps the most difficult character in the novel.
Yeah.
He's capable of love and generosity, but also tremendous pride, anger, and cruelty.
Mm.
How did you want the reader to respond to him?
Well, Charlie is David's father, so that was the conversation I was referring to just now.
Yeah.
And I wanted them in the end, and I wrote a chapter quite late on with Charlie, where it tries to explain the background to his behaviour and to his cruelty, as you say. Because I wanted the reader at least to have some understanding of the causes of that, not necessarily some empathy for him, some recognition that, as I say, he was shaped by some serious forces that were distorting his personality. And if you just focus on the behaviors, you would despise him, I think. But if you have some understanding of the history to him, then you can have at least some understanding and some empathy. And I think that's what I wanted to leave the reader with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you felt that happened in the book.
No, I think so. I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, everyone's life is difficult. I think, one can always look at, different aspects.
Mm.
And I think it moves on back to Ruth. She's in a very difficult position because she loves Charlie, but is also caught between him and her children.
Mm.
And how much agency do you think she really has?
Well, that's the question for the reader. I leave the reader with, really. It seems in the book that she doesn't have a lot, and her history too shapes that. She's lost her mother in the war. She is, I think, limited by her wartime experiences, and doesn't have the confidence and the robustness and the resourcefulness to withstand Charlie in the way that you might want her to.
But do you think you were conscious of avoiding a simple sort of villain and victim relationship?
Yes, I would. I hoped. I mean, I was certainly trying to. I didn't want it to be just a very black and white dichotomy. I wanted it to be a more nuanced look at coercive control, really, in a relationship, and how that plays out for both parties. Ruth has a relationship with her father, a relationship with her children, a relationship with her husband. You see those. They're all different and different facets of her. But in the end, she doesn't have the resourcefulness to challenge the situation she's got herself into. And that's very sad, I think.
Indeed, which I think moves all about in a way to sort of David's guilt. And he obviously spends years believing somehow he failed his mother, particularly over the break with Charlie. Near the end, Ruth tells him very simply, "You did nothing wrong." How important was that moment?
I'm not sure that it relieved David of his guilt, partly because he's imagining it, remember. So, I mean, the problem with those scenes with Ruth and David are they feel very real, but actually it's in his imagination. So
Yeah,
I think
good point.
he's right to imagine that his mother would forgive him. Whether he can absorb that forgiveness in a useful way or not, I'm not sure. And he still seems, I mean, I think he does find some peace with his mother towards the end of his life. I think he does come to some resolution, is what I would say. But whether her forgiveness penetrates, or what degree it penetrates, I'm not sure. And I
Do you think he forgives himself? Do you think he actually forgives himself?
I'm never sure about that. I don't know. It's a really good question again. I don't. I think what he comes to accept that the guilt isn't useful, which is different from forgiving himself.
But it's funny. I mean, in a way, a related thing is, in a way, why? I mean, more generally, why do people so often carry guilt for things that happened when they were young? And I think throughout, the world, isn't it? And things that probably their parents have long forgotten or brushed off, but somehow it carries them through.
I think shame is a very powerful experience. And I think for children, it stays with them a very long time. So if they have done something that is shaming, or they feel, or they have been shamed by their parents or whatever, it's a wound that doesn't heal easily. And for children particularly, it's bad enough for adults. But and I think they also absorb. I mean, I think David absorbed his mother's pain to a degree. And that stayed with him, I think he's also angry with Ruth, actually. I think he's also angry with Ruth for giving him the father she gave him. So I think it's a real mixed bag of stuff that he's feeling there. And I think he has an ambivalence to Ruth, his mother. And he does feel that he's let her down, that he didn't, he made the situation worse for her, I think is what he feels. And I think he thinks that's just true. So her forgiveness doesn't cut into that,
Yeah, so basically, yeah, exactly. He did the crime regardless, in his mind. But I think it's a lot, a lot of what we've discussed, and I think a great deal of the novel deals with death, dying, and grief. And yet, it's not an overwhelmingly bleak book by any means. I mean, how conscious were you of maintaining that balance? Because, it's quite a difficult thing to do.
Well, it was, yeah. I mean, I was worried about it being too depressing or bleak, or but actually, there's a kind of lightness and humour through it, I think.
Exactly, yeah.
That balances it out. I mean, there's a section called End of Life Care, which deals with the death of three of the male characters. But actually, they're all in their own ways, not in any way morbid. I don't go into the detail of dying. I mean, it's Charlie has a stroke and ends up in a NHS ward. And he can't speak, but if he could, what he says is, "I want to go private. I want to go private." And there's that sense of all of them straining against that, the inevitability of death in their own way, and coming to terms with it. And I think it's about the fact that they come to terms with things, or they reach resolution within those scenes, which is a more positive outcome than the fact that they actually die afterwards. The fact that they reach some kind of, even Charlie reaches some kind of resolution at the end.
Were these end of life scenes difficult to write?
Yeah.
I mean, quite, yeah.
Yeah,
and I think that sort of follows on in some of the warmest and funniest exchange in the book happen when people are very close to death, like Morris and Jean.
Yes.
Why was humour so important there?
Is
it one of the ways that people retain actually their identity at the end of life?
Yes. I mean, yes. I think so. I mean, and also there was a Jewish thing going on there. I mean, there was a very Jewish scene, that scene between Jean and Morris at the end. And there's a lot of important business going on there as well, actually. But Jean is funny. And even though she's in a hospital ward, sitting next to a very dear friend of hers who happens to be dying, she doesn't leave her humour at the door. You know, she brings it in as if she couldn't have it, as if she couldn't do it any other way. You know, it's the essence of their relationship. And so the relationship, you know, and the humour within the relationship survives this awful event. And yeah, I mean, you know, Jean was a great character to write. I mean, she was just a delight.
I was going to one of my follow-on questions was she enjoyable to write? And you actually answered that.
You know, she was just great energy. You know, and energy is, you know, it's sort of counter to death. It's in all those scenes, there's energy, I think, and that's how I countered the morbidity.
And moving on to a different aspect, you've got David's ritual of photographing the same view of Morecambe Bay every morning, and it becomes one of the central images of the book. And in fact, we use that in some of the publicity beforehand. Where did that idea come from?
That was an idea I had when I retired, which I didn't. I mean, when I thought I might have retired and I hadn't. It was a project that I'd set myself to do. I live near Morecambe Bay. I had this thought that I would go at 10 o'clock every morning and take a photograph and use it as a stimulus for reflection. And I never did it because I don't have the discipline. And it's actually a lot easier to write about it than do it. So it gave me great satisfaction to write this, to give it to David as a character and to say, you have it, you do it, because actually I don't think I ever am. And I could do it vicariously through him, which was great. So it was an idea that I had for myself.
And was the changing tide always intended as a metaphor?
Yeah.
Do you think?
Yeah. I mean, and also the salt marsh, more importantly, the salt marsh, which comes over from the other side of Morecambe Bay to the Silverdale Arnside area where I live, and it does migrate regularly. It used to be every 70 years; it's more frequently now. And that sense fascinated me, of something just transposing itself from one shore to the other. And I use that in one scene particularly as a metaphor for memory and how memory can travel from the past to the present, you know, and what's maintained and what's preserved. So the tide's going in, and I use the tide earlier in that early chapters with David's son Simon, whose relationship with his wife is coming to an end, and he says he sees himself as the constant shore and her as the restless tide. And this, you know, it might be that she's just gone further, but she's going to come back. And that's that sense of movement to and fro and away from and towards people. That was the metaphor that I was looking for, that people are constantly in flux in their relationships and moving away from and close to people. It's about proximity. Yeah.
And then eventually, which, you know, of that change, you know, David writes the words that give the novel its title, What Fools We've Been. Who is the we?
Well, I think he there is referring specifically to him and his sister. And it's his sister he thinks he sees on the shore, and it's his sister that he has been estranged from since childhood because of his father. So it's one of the destructive acts that Charlie has affected, is that he's caused estrangement within the whole family, you know. So and David, you know, he's 70 years old, and he catches sight of this woman who's being propelled by the wind along the shore, and he takes a photograph of her because she happens to be in the frame of this photograph he takes, and it catches him because it looks just like a photograph of his sister, and that's the we initially. But actually, of course, it includes everybody, really. We've all been fools in the way that we've conducted relationships or conducted our lives to some degree. So I used it as the title because even though it's very specific, it has a kind of generalized application.
Irene is the missing person in the family tree, and yet she turns out to have been living remarkably close to Jess. Why did you want Jess to be the person who finally finds her?
because it's the final act of putting the jigsaw together. I mean, there was the other metaphor that's in the book is jigsaw, and how jigsaws start from pieces and you assemble them and they become a picture that's interpretable. And Irene was a piece that Jess was captivated by right in the first chapter. She identifies in the family tree that nobody knows anything about Irene. And I think it becomes her quest to find out about her, because I think she thinks Irene is the person who might best explain who Jess is. So she's fairly driven to find, I don't know how she finds her actually, but I think it creates the symmetry of the book. It gives an ending that matches the beginning. It gives a sense of resolution around the family just starting to piece itself together again and heal some of the hurts. And Jess, they exchange gifts. It's quite ritualistic in a way. And they end on a slightly mysterious note, but a sense of a strong connection having been made, which is good for both of them, healing for both of them. So it's an act of healing, I think.
And do you think the youth makes Jess more willing to ask questions that the adults have avoided? Is she less burdened by the family's loyalties,
Well, it's interesting. I was going to say she's much more curious than they are, but then that's avoiding the question in a way. I think she is freer to do it. Yeah, I think she's less burdened. I think she's less frightened, actually, less affected by the dynamic. And actually, she's angry as well. I mean, the book starts with...
Well, we come on to that, in a minute.
So she's got a kind of energy that and I think she's the one who's motivated to do something positive about the situation. And I think she's the only one who has that motivation. And I think there's some generosity of spirit in Jess that is her trait, So I think her desire to do good is part of her trait of who she is.
Yeah, well, coming on to what I was going to say, because it begins the book with her furious about the breakup of her parents' marriage. And I remember reading the first script when, Laura sent it to me, and actually you just got that teenage angst and rage. I mean, just, au point. But by the end, she discovered generations of estrangement and reconciliation. What do you think she's actually learned?
I think she is doing what I'm hoping the reader learns, which is avoidable suffering should be avoided. That there is, and what you said earlier, that communication is everything, and connection is everything, and contact. So I think she learns that she wants to buck the trend of the family in terms of disconnection, and she wants to make good. So I think she learns about herself that she has the power to heal the situation. And I think that's huge learning for a 40, and by the end I think she's 15, but that age, to feel and start defining and mobilizing that power and that the resourcefulness. If you compare Jess to Ruth, for example, as children, she is, even though they're both evacuated to a degree at that age, or Ruth's a bit younger, Ruth's evacuated because of the war. Jess feels she's being evacuated because she's being taken to her father. She doesn't want to go. They respond so differently, and I think it is, times elapsed and it's a different time, and there's more empowerment of women than there was in Ruth's day. And but I think she learns that it is possible to overturn the fates to some, if you can take small steps to do that, and by making connection and acting out of generosity and goodwill, you can affect small change, is what I think she's learned. That's what I heard. That's, I think, the message of the book.
I think, so would you say she's actually the most hopeful person in the book?
Yeah.
I mean, she is, in a way, she starts off the annoying teenager But it's like a good movie, isn't it? You don't particularly like her at the beginning, but by the end you do.
Yeah, I hope
So,
so.
uh, sorry. I don't know. This is what I shouldn't have done. Sorry, I'll have to cut that bit out. Anyway, we'll continue.
Yes.
I'm just coming on now to the really more personal question in a way. The book is dedicated simply for my mother. How personal is What Fools We Have Been?
Well, there's elements of my story in it, I would say. And so, particularly the Charlie character is very close to my father, and I had some of David's experience there. So there is some autobiographical drawing, quite heavy drawing, but there's a moment in the book when I wrote the short story, which is now chapter 4, but it was the first thing I wrote, and David does invite his mother to visit him for the weekend. He sort of reaches back into his memory and finds her there and invites her. And she says, "I thought you'd never ask." And at that moment, she stopped being my mother, and she became a different character. And in a way, the book became less about me. And so, although I use some of my story to inform the book, most of it's made up.
But
Jess, for example, Jess is an entirely fictional character. For example.
But do you think that writing the book made you feel differently about your own family when you look back at it, or was it set in stone already?
I think I'd worked a lot of stuff through, earlier in my life around. I did a lot of work on it, therapeutic work, and did find my peace with it to a large extent. I not totally, and I still at times see my father in me in ways that I don't like, and my inheritances, my traits. So I don't think we're ever fully reconciled to,
Yeah.
But the book, I don't know if the book helped. It was a very interesting exercise for me in drawing on that experience, and I mean, the point of view keeps shifting. So I think what I was doing was, well, it's not autobiographical. I was putting myself in characters' heads and seeing it from their point of view. And I think that process was illuminating for me, really, to see what it might have been like from their perspective. Yeah. So in that sense, it was very productive and helpful.
Which I think brings us on to a related point. I mean, I think one idea that I kept coming back to is that people often realize too late how actually little they know about their parents. Are there questions you wish you had asked?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I wish I knew more. Yeah, I wish I knew more about. These are Jewish immigrants, and my family were Jewish immigrants, and I'd like to have known more about the story of their leaving and arriving, and what they left, and what they came with. All that, I think I would, and in a way, that's. I mean, David doesn't ask his mother those questions when she comes to visit, but those are the questions I regret not having asked. I think I would certainly have wanted to understand my mother's experience of my father. Yeah. So yes, I mean, I could write a list of the things that I would like to know. I think would be a good exercise for me, but that's certainly the case. I mean, particularly, my mother dying when I was 23, and I was already forcibly estranged from her by then, so I hadn't really had any contact with her for since my early 20s, probably.
Yeah.
So, yeah. There is quite a lot, really. But I only had one grandparent alive. And I would have liked to have spoken to. I wish I'd spoken to him a bit more and asked him a bit more, really.
Yeah, I mean, I had some experience. I mean, I didn't know my father's parents at all. I mean, I think my father's father was, died when I was 3. So one has a very vague memory. And my mother's ones, they lived till I was about 6 or 7. But, they seem to be ancient. In fact, they're younger than probably we are now,
You're ancient.
But you know what I mean. And there are so many questions one wish, one would love to have sat down with a drink of them on a winter's evening, and just when no one else around, and just asked, what about this? And I think quite often you get the grandparent crossover, that things can be said by both sides that they can't say to the immediate generation, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it's interesting, because I was just thinking as you were speaking, because Jess doesn't actually ask that many questions at the end. I mean, I'm sure she's got a lot of questions she'd like to ask, but I think it is a matter of, you have to build up the conditions in which those questions are possible to ask, I think. Do you know what I mean? You can't just...
Yeah, absolutely. It's not sort of like an interview, and even then, basic, it's got to be in the right atmosphere for the people to unwind.
The right level of trust, I think.
Yeah. Just going back, in a way, of the role of fiction, I think, and then David, obviously, we've discussed inventing parts of Ruth's story because she's no longer there to tell him. Is that something fiction can uniquely do, basically to allow us to reach into those gaps where documentary history stops?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I wanted David to use his put his imagination to a sort of outward purpose as well as an inward purpose. And by, he uses his imagination to invite the memory of his mother to visit him. And there is a story there, but it's very much a story for David, if you like. When he writes those 4 chapters about Ruth, and he fills in the gaps and he uses his imagination, I think he's doing something very different, both for himself, but he's making a contribution there, but in a way, reaching over time to his mother in a very different way, and offering her something. But he is using his imagination for the reader's benefit. He's the writer there, in effect, not me. And I think that really interested me around that transfer of authorship at that point in the book. And then it sort of comes back to me after that imagined life is written. But I felt it was important for David to attempt the story, if you know what I mean. And for his own sake, for his own solidity and sense of time and place, but also to put it out there as an offering.
Yeah. Well, and that comes up in a way, touching what we discussed before. But I think, do you think that really all family narratives, not just in the book, but everyone's, are partly imagined?
Yeah, well, they have to be, I think, unless people know everything, which you never do. You never know everything, and whether it's imagined or you just bring your interpretation to bear from your own personality and your own needs and your own psyche and how you see the family. I mean, there's never one perspective on the family. I'd put it that way. Every member of the family has their own story to tell from their own perspective, their own feelings around the family dynamic. There's never an objective truth about it. So in that sense, it's imagined, if you like. That we have our fantasies, we have our imaginings about that.
I think coming to a close, when a reader closes What Fools We Have Been for the final time, what would you most like them to take away from it?
Well, I tell you what I know happens for a lot of readers, that they read it again almost immediately, which is great. I mean, it's a short book, but actually I think most people read it twice. I think I would want them to take away some reflections about them and their family, and how they manage their relationships to their family and what they know and how curious they are and what they want. And within that, this sense that resolution or reconciliation is always possible. Whatever the difficulties or tensions that there might be, at some point within the family system, there is the potential for reconciliation or resolution. That's, I think, the main message that I want them to take away.
And finally, after spending so long with his family, do you miss them?
I do. I do. Yes, I do. It was a very powerful experience in that sense. I'm very close to them, and I am writing about some of them now in a sequel type book, and I've got another one in mind that would continue some of the story going forward. So they're still with me, but yeah, I miss Gene. I think Gene was just great, and I miss Morris. I think he's a really interesting character, very complicated character actually. So yes, I do. I must read it again. I haven't read it for a while. I must bring myself back to.
Hank Williams, thanks very much for your time. Hank Williams, What Fools We Have Been. It's available in hardback from Chiselbury and everywhere else you want to get your books. And it's on ebook, and I really recommend it. So Hank Williams, thank you very much for your time in Chiselbury Conversations.
Well, thank you. It was a great conversation. I really valued it. Thank you.
Goodbye.
So